Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Cloud Nothings called Life Without Sound. So I tend to talk a lot about artistic progression in these reviews, how artists choose to evolve or mature their sound over time, trying to place everything in its proper context. But here's the unfortunate other side to all this. Sometimes an act might grow or mature or evolve in a particular way that might be good for the band, especially long term, but not always to my taste as a critic. And I can't tell you how unbelievably frustrating that is, especially if you can tell that the level of quality remains the same. I probably will still respect the band, but hey, it happens. Sometimes it doesn't catch your ear in the same way. It doesn't resonate on that same level. Experiencing art is often emotional. That can happen. Like, take for instance Cloud Nothings. Like most people, I really love their 2012 Steve Albini produced album Attack on Memory for its bite and its sharp hooks, its melodic interplay, the well-defined writing. And yet when they released the follow-up in 2014 with Here and Nowhere Else, see, it wasn't that it was bad, it just didn't have the same edge for me. Part of which I will blame on a change in producer to John Congleton, although Congleton's put out good stuff in the past, but the hooks just weren't as sticky to me. It just didn't feel as sharp, partially because of the loss of their main guitarist and some of that melodic interplay, and partially because the production seemed to muddy the band's strengths by pushing into fuzzier territory, and going lo-fi isn't always the best option when you're trying to emphasize more of those melodies. It didn't feel as immediate or gripping to me, and when word was coming down the pipe that this new project, Life Without Sound, was going to be both a little bit cleaner, a little brighter, a little bit more relaxed, courtesy of producer John Goodmanson, known for his work with Sleater-Kinney and Death Cab for Cutie, well, I was interested, but I had some serious concerns. But hey, did Cloud Nothings manage to blow past my expectations? Well, alright. I gotta be honest with this. This review got delayed a number of times since I started working on it. Thanks to Patreon votes and my own overloaded schedule and desire to stay on top of everything in order to stay relevant, it's only now that this wound up on the top of my schedule. But there's also another part of this, and that involves me listening to this album off and on for the past month or a half or so, since it was first released in late January, and trying to pull together something of a coherent opinion. And here's the thing, I'm gonna be trying my hardest to avoid comparisons to Attack on Memory. I can't make any promises, but I will try. Especially given that album was intentionally a lot darker and a wiry release, and they're not looking to go in that direction with Life Without Sound, which is indeed a brighter, I dare say even more accessible than that star-making album in 2012. And while there was a part of me that really wanted to just dismiss this out of hand for not hitting that height or going in that direction, a lot of repeated listens have given me the impression that Cloud Nothings have hit a strange sort of balance with Life Without Sound. I'm not sure they're ever going to hit that nervy edge that allowed Attack on Memory to really cut for me, but I do think there is something worth considering here. Otherwise, I probably would have dropped this record from my schedule weeks ago, given how busy I am right now. It is a good project, let me stress this. There is something to it, but I just wouldn't say it's a great one in that higher echelon. And a big part of this, indeed the element that I think easily pushes this above Here and Nowhere Else, is that they finally hired another lead guitarist to replace Joe Boyer, unfortunately named Chris Brown, and it's not the same person, I checked. And given that they were necessarily forced to simplify things when Dylan Baldy was handling both the frontman singing and lead guitar duties, this actually finally brings back some of that melodic focus that was missing on that 2014 album. Of course, that's necessarily a consequence of John Goodmanson's production. Not only does he tilt the balance in the mix to click up more of the cleaner vocals, a lot more to the forefront, that guitar melody is also much closer to the front of the mix, anchored by sharp bass work from TJ Duke and Jason Garrix's consistently underrated drum work. He really does a good job there, although I do find some of the cymbal pickups to be a little muddy. And while Goodmanson, he's not Steve Albini in capturing some of that nervy immediacy that I've loved about previous Cloud Nothings albums, he plays to the group's ability to churn out consistent hooks pretty effectively, almost to the point of actually having maybe some mainstream, possibly indie pop appeal. It's certainly true that songs like Modern Act, they're among the cleanest and most structured songs that Cloud Nothings has ever released, certainly they're most accessible, but I'm also not denying the hooks there, or on songs like Enter Entirely, probably my favorite song on this album, or Internal World, or Things Are Alright With You, that they aren't catchy as hell, mostly driven by more prominent melody lines that are often really good. And that's also not saying this album doesn't embrace distortion or dissonance when it needs to, from the muse-like dissonant tones that split through the hook of Enter Entirely, to the louder, more cacophonous crescendos that build up to some pretty triumphant moments on Darkened rings, almost to the point where you can feel like they're left hanging a little bit when they crash back into the main riff, almost like that song could pay itself off a little more. And Strange Year and Realize My Fate both contribute to a pretty downbeat and borderline noise rock or post-punk ending for this album, especially as the grooves just simmer and the layers of distortion pile up around that main guitar line. They really got this dark, ominous presence that actually gets pretty abrasive. But here's the odd thing. I actually think I might prefer the brighter, more melodic progressions more, especially with Goodmanson's production. He's not really giving the bass or the kick drums or the rhythm guitar the thick, chugging low end to really pay off some of those darker moments, giving them that muscle. Hell, with the cleaner piano slipping in and the borderline pop-punk vocal arrangements and melodies and the multi-tracking, it's almost as if he's terrified of pivoting into really meaty territory. But it seems like nobody told Dylan Baldy that, because while he is capable of more melodic singing, he only really brings a lot of urgency to his delivery when his voice gets more guttural and aggressive. When he's in his more melodic range, he's actually kind of reminiscent of Rimmer's Cuomo, with maybe a little bit more restraint to him, which can fit the more laid-back vibe, but again, it's not exactly imbuing these songs with a shot of greater life in order to match some of their melodic hooks. You kind of wish he was a little bit more forward-thinking on those songs. Of course, part of this ties into the lyrical arc of this record. As Baldy has stated, this is arguably Cloud Nothing's most complex album to date in that department. And yeah, I would agree with that, to say that Nothing of this probably being their most mature project to date too. Written during and in the aftermath of a breakup, there's a real acknowledgement of hitting a crossroads, both in his lingering feelings for this partner and the art that came out of those feelings as a result. He knew he could continue to simmer and stew in his own dark emotions, lashing out at anybody else in his path, but he doesn't want to do that anymore. It's unpleasant. And as such, the first half of this album has him dismantling the defense mechanism that is his anger and his resentment and his heartbreak, finding clarity in the light of his feelings and vulnerability and the truth, but also realizing he's not always right in that regard. Indeed, the reason why the first half of this album can feel so triumphant is that he's finally coming out into the light, breaking out of the peace that he felt in the shadows into something that's a little bit more pure, if a little bit more uncomfortable, only to realize that the rest of the world has a very different view of this sort of complicated and yet intense emotion. Modern Act is the moment where there's real exasperation coming in out of the Fakers, and yeah, it's an obvious single choice, but it is a really good song. But then we get an interesting twist. See, he knew the darkness, the misery, he recognized that path of emotion both for himself and his art, but when you step beyond that, he's in very much uncharted territory. He doesn't know where to go next, and as much as he might want to go back down that darker well with a partner possibly returning to the picture, that option, as he knows, probably isn't going to work. It leads to an interesting and emotionally nuanced point, that there's an odd sort of comfort in what society would brand as bad emotions or self-destructive tendencies, mostly because it's familiarity to so many people, especially in art. And now, not having that comfort of direction or being in a better place, while he is there, it leaves the album on a really uncertain, kind of bleak ending. That fear of the unknown leading, possibly dragging him into an unfamiliar, possibly even more chilling and unnerving emptiness. Again, some of this feels like a little bit of conjecture. Like most Cloud Nothing's albums, the language is pretty basically structured. It's kind of oblique in its details, almost to the point of being underwritten. But between that album cover and the odd emotional through line of this album, you know what? I think it kind of fits. But where do I fall on this album as a whole? Honestly, I like it, mostly because Cloud Nothings have returned to a quartet sound while still advancing an interesting thematic arc with some, indeed, really good hooks. That said, it's definitely an album that grows on you over time, as it's nowhere near as immediate or punchy as an album like Attack on Memory was. And I can see some people thinking that the production makes some segments kind of blur together, not really have the same personality as, again, what you had with Steve Albini. It's consistent to the point where it really could afford to take more chances in the melodies. But as a whole, I'm thinking a very strong 7 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation. Providing you haven't heard this album already, it did drop in late January. Again, as I said, I'm really late to the punch here. It is worth considering, especially even to more of the accessible, guitar-driven side of indie rock. Otherwise, it's a tough album to evaluate, at least for me, but in opening up all those possibilities, I think it's worth your consideration. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. So many takes to get this review right, but hey, I wanted to finally get it out and get it out in front of you guys. Beyond that, the link if you want to get this album is in the description below, and I got the poll up here. I'm curious where Cloud Nothing fans have fallen on this album. I've heard it's a little bit divisive, but I want to hear your opinion. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation? If you guys actually want to get more involved in my scheduling process so this sort of thing doesn't happen again, the link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week contributors get to vote, and once per week on Saturdays, the higher contributors get to add albums or movies to my schedule. Again, link for more details is there. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.